These men will present cases for and against organized religion, its influence on the world and its history, and impact on current events. Each will explore the social, political, and historical foundations of religious faith. Christopher Hitchens was born in Portsmouth, England. He was educated at both Cambridge and Oxford universities. He has been a correspondent and travel writer from more than 60 countries and is a frequent contributor to leading journals, not to mention being a commentator and a critic on matters of social concern. Christopher is a prolific writer with several books to his credit that span a career of more than 4 decades. Dinesh Dsouza was born and raised in Mumbai and left India at the age of 17 to attend high school in Arizona. In 1983, he graduated with a degree in English from Dartmouth College. He is a best-selling author, a former senior policy analyst in the Reagan administration, and once served as a research fellow at Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He too has written several books and frequently appears on broadcasts in the news as well as in the media. I'd like to begin this event by asking each of our guests to include a brief statement about something personal. How have your views developed since youth, and what events or realizations have shaped your religious perspectives?
I think it's important to bear in mind that religion is essentially a simple proposition. It's preached by the semi-literate to the illiterate. It's intended to be received by the simple, to be simply understood and believed or not as a matter of faith. The whole superstructure and architecture of theology is an add-on, a rationalization, an attempt to deal with the incessant challenges posed by mere brute reality to the idea of a faith-based world. So I make no apology for describing my own childlike repudiation of the idea of a supreme author of all things. I suppose I was 10. I was in a boys' boarding school in Devonshire, in the southwest of my country of birth. Very beautiful. And our nature teacher, Mrs. Watts, a pious old trout, with a heart of gold, would take us on nature walks and show us the birds, the shrubs. I forget now the taxonomy of all this kind of thing. I'm rather a city boy these days, but that was her job, and it was enjoyable. But she also doubled as scripture knowledge teacher, which was a class I enjoyed much more, and religion being mandatory in education in England. And one day, she overreached herself and tried to fuse her role as nature teacher with that of divinity instructor, and said, "Children, boys, you may have noticed that all the vegetation, the trees, the grass, the rest of it is green, shades of green, which happens to be the color most perfectly adapted to our eyes, the most restful for our eyes. And God could have made them purple, or he could have made them orange or something frightful and clashing, but no, we know he's good because he made the green suit us so well." I was 10. I knew nothing about the many different ways in which the eyes of humans and other mammals and primates and beasts have evolved. I knew none of any of that at all. But I knew as if by instinct that the eye had adapted to the vegetation and not the other way around. Simple, you think, yes, but essential. So it was only a short step because, as you will, I'm sure many of you know from your own lives, you'll have found it's impossible to be just a little bit heretical. That's why religion demands this terrifying superstructure of theology and apologetics to keep on dealing with the inevitable objections. Well, the next thing I noticed was the headmaster is a bit of a brute and a bit of a bully. But it's harder than it would normally be with such a person to challenge him, because every day he holds the Bible in his hand and conducts divine service. And he's invested with a great authority, the greater authority, I should say, by this than he would be on his own merits, shall we say. Another insight, a childish one, but useful. Religion is a tremendous reinforcer of illegitimate authority. And it takes the form of humans claiming to be acting in the name of God. A claim that no human can decently make intellectually, and which is very bad for them to make in any case. If you want to see a normal person behave badly, really badly, you would expect to hear them say, don't mind me, I'm just on a mission from God, I'm doing His will. You hear a person talk like that, you don't move towards them, do you? You move away. Well, that was my instinct too. And how near am I to my 4 minutes? I have a feeling I may be trespassing.
You have 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, if you haven't got the point by now, you're even more simple-minded than I was then.
It is for me, a very eerie feeling to be up here. Christopher Hitchens and I have debated several times before, but this is actually our first public debate following his announcement of cancer. I've gotten to know Christopher. I've known him for 20 years, but feel for him a great affection, and so find my voice quivering a little bit, because in some sense we are here in our frail condition debating topics that are really critical. When we look at the possibility of death, a possibility that comes to us all, we face the astounding claim by the religious believer that this life is not the only life. Now that's a factual claim. We're going to die, and there's going to be something after, or there's going to be nothing. But we don't seem to be in a good position to know on this side of the curtain what's true. And so it's not, I think, easy to write this off. I was raised in India. Now, my family is Catholic, converted by Portuguese missionaries in the south of India, a small place called Goa. One time I asked my grandfather, how did we become Catholics? And he said, well, it was the Portuguese Inquisition. The Portuguese came with the Bible in one hand and a sword in the other, and it proved to be a very persuasive combination. And it was only later, as I learned a little bit more about the history of India, that I realized that was partly true, but not the full story. The truth of it is a lot of Indians actually flung themselves into the arms of the missionaries. Why? Because they were Hindus, they were in the caste system, they were on the lower rungs of the ladder. And in the caste system, it doesn't matter what your merit is, you're stuck. And so even though the missionaries might have been greedy and imperious and not fully practiced their ideals of universal brotherhood, the very fact that they had these ideals was enough to convince a lot of low-caste Hindus to become Christians. Anyway, as I grew up, I had, I think, an appreciation of the social benefits of Christianity, but I think when I look back on it, I'd call it a crayon Christian. Now, what I mean by that was that having learned my faith at my parents' knee, it was really not Christianity. It was a Christianity simplified to my young mind. And for many of us, that's the Christianity we grew up with. That's the Christianity I brought to America. It's the Christianity I took to the Dartmouth campus at the age of 17. Dartmouth, of course, was founded as a Christian college. So were really all the Ivy League colleges except one, Cornell, was founded as a Christian institution. Dartmouth was actually founded to educate and Christianize the Indians. I sometimes wonder how I got there. I think I misread the catalog, the part about the Indians. The point I want to make is that very often when we enter university life or public life, our faith gets battered. It gets battered by the acid currents of skepticism. And we often realize that the childhood faith that we were raised in, we can't defend in the teeth of these kinds of objections. So I found myself pulling away from Christianity and only rediscovered it, re-encountered it, if you will, in adult life. And I realized that many of the foolish things I'd been taught when I was 5 were true, but had to be defended with a completely different intellectual ammunition than anything that was provided in Sunday school or in church. And so one of the reasons I like to take part in these debates is, in some sense, I feel like in adult life I'm able to bring my faith and reason closer together and able to make the case, or attempt to make the case, for God and for Christianity, but not by appealing to revelation or sacred texts or the Bible, but rather using the vocabulary of reason alone.
I'm going to ask you two questions. Let's start with Dinesh, since you're already at the platform. How does each of you define God as generally implied in the historical and theological concept? What is God?
I think that there have been many definitions of God. To me, the best one was given by the medieval theologian Anselm, who basically said God is that than which no greater can be thought. It's a sort of a dense phrase, but it encapsulates a lot. What it's really saying is that if you take the qualities of greatness, omniscience, omnipotence, creative power, beauty, truth, and you extend them, as it were, to infinity, that being, if there is such a being, would be God. So God is, and this is the monotheistic idea of God, not of course the Greeks, the Romans who believed in many gods, the god of the rivers, the god of the oceans, and so on. With monotheism, we have this idea of a single God, embodying, if you will, this perfection. So the author of the universe, the creator of us and our world, and ultimately our judge. Those would be the different, to me, key elements of what it means to say the word God.
Since we still have time, would you make a distinction between something that is divine and God?
Yes, because, well, first of all, I think there's a difference between the Eastern and the Western conceptions of God. There are Buddhist understandings of the transcendent that don't involve God, but do involve transcendence, or you may say divinity. Certainly in Christianity, there's a belief in angels, in the idea of a fallen angel, Lucifer. So these can have aspects of divinity or transcendence, but they wouldn't be God. So,
and since you're talking on Christianity, what about Jesus?
Jesus is the Son of God and is God and is a part of God. So Jesus would be, you might say, the divine ambassador from the transcendent realm into the human realm, communicating and embodying, if you will, God's message and His will. So in that sense, Jesus would be the Savior sent by God as part of God to atone for our sins.
And the second question on this, do you distinguish between the terms religion and faith, and how?
The term religion means to bind, to weld together, and so religion has more to do with community, a set of beliefs, a set of practices. Of course, religions differ. In ancient Judaism, as with modern Islam, religion is a matter of law. It's a way of life. The Qur'an, in that sense, is a comprehensive book that covers not only theology, but commerce and divorce and inheritance. It's a sort of rule book for life. In Christianity, religion is defined more creedally. I profess, I believe, I hold. Faith is something different. Faith is often understood, I think, wrongly as something that you believe in the absence of evidence. Faith opposed to reason. That's not my view of faith at all. My view of faith is the jump you have to make when reason ends. In other words, you deploy reason to its full capacity, giving it complete authority, but there are some subjects on which reason stops short or falls silent, or even when you've plugged in all the data, you still don't know, and yet you have to act. So faith is that practical bridge that takes you from, you might say, conviction to action, when even though you aren't sure, you have to go for it.
Christopher, same questions. How do you define God? And I suspect it'll be a different definition.
Well, if you, which I'm very glad Dinesh does, if you agree to avoid sort of Zen-like koans and word games and things like God is all, or God is love, or God is everywhere, which corollary would be everywhere is God, I suppose. Meaningless. And if you attempt to attribute meaning to it, you have two choices essentially. There's what was once called a deistic, still is, interpretation, favored by many of our founding fathers, that believed there was a universal author of all things, evidenced in the apparent symmetry and harmony of the created universe. But that there was no evidence for the theistic position, which is necessary for religion, because a person who thinks they've proved the existence of God has all their work ahead of them to become a person of faith, because they then have to prove that this universal author cares about you and me in detail, intervenes, cares who wins which war, cares who you go to bed with and in what position, cares what animals you eat. Heaven hates ham for a lot of people, and so forth. Now, it's impossible to refute completely either position, except to say there's no evidence at all for them, which I suppose is where faith comes in. My interpretation will be this. There is in our makeup a terrible need for security and a terrible fear. The anthropomorphic gods, I call them that because I believe them all to have been man-made, tend to be very heavy-duty fathers who want to be at their children's funeral rather than their children being at theirs, a tyrannical inversion of the natural order, against whose rule there is no appeal, and very capricious, and often sadistic. And it seems to me that that is a servile need on our part, and one without which we could very well do. For me, the best moment of last week, actually not just last week, but actually the best moment this century, I'm sure most of you know what I'm about to talk about, the extraordinary upwelling of dignity, even nobility in Egypt, was the moment when Mubarak went on television and addressed his people and claiming to be the father of them all. Not the first such person to try it. And must have been a bit depressed when, with one united yell, in effect they said, no, we'd rather be orphans. That to me, ladies and gentlemen, comrades, is emancipation defined. No, I don't want an all-seeing, all-knowing father who won't quit. No, I don't want to be told that I have to love him. Compulsory love is a disgusting idea to me, a servile, totalitarian idea. Made worse by its natural accompaniment, this person who exacts your love, demands it, and can condemn you for withholding it, is someone whom you must also fear. This is the world of Big Brother. And it leads, in practice, to people deifying themselves. And so we get the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, against whose word there's no appeal, because he's God's representative on earth. We get the Vicar of Christ, the pathetic Bavarian bureaucrat and cover-up artist Joseph Ratzinger, the infallible Pope, Vicar of Christ on earth. We have a book, the Qur'an, which is dictated, well, actually by the Archangel Gabriel, but acting as God's proxy. Words that cannot be altered. This is tyranny in the mind. The beginning of emancipation is to turn your back on it and to say, no, I'd rather have all the risks of independence, of taking my own decisions, of thinking for myself. Any day taking those chances is better for you than reposing yourself in the care of a celestial dictator. You can have faith without religion, in that you can believe something so much that it's second nature to you. I mean, I suppose things like the likelihood of the sun rising in the east tomorrow. So I would say I have reasonable faith in that proposition. You can put quite a lot of trust in some human beings, or you often feel you have to. But it doesn't take a religious form. It's not superstitious. It doesn't demand a supernatural dimension. Religion, I think, is indissoluble from faith. It has to, so to say, take certain things on faith. And indeed, has been preached very often. You have to have faith in order to believe. The rationalist proposition is, of course, the other way around. You only have faith in what you think has been reasonably experimented with, demonstrated, challenged, and survives the challenges of evidence. So I think if I could make one change in American idiom and vernacular, it would be this. When some personage puts themselves forward for election and announces, as if spreading the fan of a peacock, I'm a person of faith, they expect you to respect that. That is a statement expecting respect and deference. I don't particularly care to be told by someone who wants to represent me that he's prepared to believe a large number of things without any evidence at all. I'm perfectly prepared to find that out about him or her for myself. It's rather alarming that they think it's a clever and nice thing to announce in advance. So again, I think my objections to that whole method of thought ought to be self-evident.
Dinesh, we're moving on to faith in history. First question. Has belief in a divine being assisted or prevented humans throughout history to advance in culture and understanding?
I'd like to answer that question first by saying one word about faith, and that is that we have faith that democracy in Egypt will turn out for the best. Science is based on a kind of faith. Faith in what? Faith in a rational universe. The concept of a rational universe cannot be proven. It is assumed. If we see light and measure it traveling at a certain speed, speed c, 186,000 miles a second, how do we know that light 1,000,000 years ago, or on a star 5 light years away, also travels at that speed? We don't know that. We assume it. And we assume it because we have plugged in a hidden assumption, the orderliness of nature. That is not a discovery of science, but a faith-based premise of science. Now, where did this faith-based premise come from? It came from religion. That's the great irony. You have to ask the question, why did science, modern science, and I don't just mean human curiosity, but the scientific method, what Whitehead called the invention of invention, why did that develop in Western civilization and no other civilization? I would argue that it has to do with the Christian idea of a rational God, an omniscient God who created a universe lawfully. The Islamic thinker Al-Ghazali denies that. He says the universe has no laws. Everything happens at every nanosecond because Allah wills it. So science develops in the soil of the West, not just because of Christianity alone. There's the influence of Athens, but there's also the influence of Jerusalem, and it's the creative tension between those two that gives rise not just to science, but democracy. Think about it. Where does the idea of equal rights, equal dignity come from? Thomas Jefferson was not a particularly religious man, in fact, one of the most heterodox of the founders, when he sat down to list the source of rights, the root of the idea that all men are equal. He said all men are created equal. Our rights come from our Creator. This man of science, of the Enlightenment, could think of no other source for rights than the concept of a transcendent God in whose eyes we are all created equal. And out of that divine equality comes the political idea of human equality. So I think that when we trace not just our religious, but our secular ideas, the dignity of the individual, the preciousness, or as we might say, sacredness, the sanctity of life, the equal dignity of women, even the moral pressure against slavery, a universal institution that only became controversial in one civilization, the civilization historically known as Christendom. So we know why people had slaves. It's really great to have other people work for you for free. That doesn't require explanation. What requires explanation is why this universal practice that was like the family, accepted everywhere, became unacceptable in one civilization because a group of people, Quakers, evangelical Christians, and others, began to say, no, if we are created equal in the eyes of God, no man has the right to rule another man without consent. So this is a little sense of the ways in which I think our secular culture has been fertilized by Christian ideas.
I want to break with format for a moment and extend the same question as a rebuttal, if that's okay, Christopher. Again, has belief in a divine being assisted or prevented humans throughout history to advance in culture and understanding?
Well, if I may, I'll include a rebuttal also.
I'm going to go back to him, but I want to make sure you get a chance to respond in kind.
Well, just first off, Dinesh, science, which is, I think, was better off when it was called natural philosophy, which it was in Newton's time. Science is a very recent 19th century neologism. By no means postulates a rational universe. I mean, if you just look at the most recent work of Lawrence Krauss, for example, who's a physicist, great genius, known to me, I won't say comprehended entirely by me, he's the man who discovered that the Hubble red light shift, which shows that the universe is expanding faster away from itself than we had thought it was doing, it was thought after that discovery that that rate of acceleration would have to decline, if only for sort of quasi-Newtonian reasons. No, it's not. It's speeding up. Very soon, in real time, not in our time, very soon the sky will be almost clear. We won't be able to see the stars anymore. Very lucky we found out about the Big Bang at the time when we did it. We could have missed the whole thing. There's a huge amount of nothingness coming, just as a great deal of nothingness where we came from, and a great deal of chaos and randomness and destruction. One sun, one star, blowing up every single second since the Big Bang and as we sit here. This is not a rational universe. The rational universe idea was the crazy pre-Copernican, pre-Galilean one of the Christian church and others, that the Earth is not just the center of the solar system, which moves around it, but is the center of the created universe and is the home of a specially created species who exist to vindicate their creator. That nonsensical cosmology at least was, so to say, explicable and intelligible. It's blown apart by the very first scientific investigations. Second, I mean, in a small way, I'm Thomas Jefferson's biographer, and I know a lot about the writing of the Declaration. I have to say that the word creator is in there because they are all determined not to say a God or the Trinity or Jesus, as there was some pressure to do. Whether Thomas Jefferson says it or not, and I yield to very few in my admiration for him, it is no more true that God endowed us with rights than it was true, as had been believed by everybody 50 years before, that God gave rights only to kings, that kings ruled by divine right. Both propositions are equally nonsensical. I agree here with Bertrand Russell, who said the statement "there is a God" is as meaningless as the statement "there is not." It's all white noise. It proves nothing to say this about Thomas Jefferson. In other words, now on the question of whether religion retards progress or not. Well, one reason I find this debate in any form endlessly interesting is that the debate over religion is the original debate. Religion was human species' first try at everything. It's our first attempt at cosmology to make sense of what we see in the heavens. It's our first attempt at biology, trying to classify species with ourselves at the top. Of course, it's in a way our first attempt at medicine and healthcare by means of the promise of faith being rewarded by cure. Very crude, but it's a start. Most important to me, and you can probably think of other ways in which religion is our first collective attempt to make sense. For this it deserves respect, of course, and I would mention in particular the fact that it's the first text that humans have in common. The first time anything is ever written down, held in common. There's a terrible struggle to get it translated into the vernacular and out of the language of priesthood, but still, it is the study of text and language. That's where religion began. I would say that by the 15th or 16th century, at any rate, religion had done all it was ever going to be able to do in that respect, and began to exert a retarding effect on further knowledge. It didn't want Galileo to find this kind of stuff out. It's always hated Einstein. It disliked the idea of inoculation. A germ theory of disease means that disease is not punishment. Okay? And the authority of priesthood goes right there. Everyone probably could think of an example of their own, from today's world too. It's not just the old struggles against the ignorance and superstition of the papacy and the Calvinists. That there is a rooted opposition now, it seems to me, of those who truly believe that God is the author of all things and the intervener in all things, and our controller and our supreme dear leader. And the discoveries that science makes about the awe-inspiring extent of the known universe, our paltry place in it, from that macro effect to the micro observations that we can now make about the extraordinary sentience of other creatures and the extraordinary extent to which we are chromosomally their kin. All of this tends to undermine the religious worldview, and I don't think that can possibly be by coincidence, because the religious worldview depends on faith, and faith is blind.
The universe is expanding, and so what sense can one make of this remarkable development? In other words, the fact that the universe is moving further apart, that's the consequence of the Big Bang. And right there we have the presumption of law of rationality. We can infer from an explosion that we can trace it back in time and say the universe is 13.5 billion years old, because that's how long it's been blowing up. And we're living with the effects of that original cataclysmic explosion. And then the discovery just a few decades ago that this expansion of the universe is accelerating. How can that be? Because if there's an explosion, if I pick up a stone and throw it, it's going to go, but after a while it's going to slow down. But what if it goes faster? Well, reason tells us that something is pushing it. Scientists call this dark energy. In other words, no one has ever seen dark energy. No one has ever touched it or found it under the microscope. It's different. It has properties unlike any energy we know. And yet it is presumed to exist. Why? Because something must be pushing this universe further apart. Something must be responsible for the acceleration. So I'm trying to illustrate the way in which the presumption of a lawful, orderly universe allows us to make deductions, even when there's absolutely no empirical evidence in front of us. This is the scientific process. It is embedded with the presumption of rationality. Galileo didn't produce rationality against Ptolemy. He provided a superior rationality. Galileo said God's plan is more devious, more complex, more fantastic, more admirable than the one that was there before. Kepler made the same point. His ideas, his equations, and his tracing of the elliptical movement of the planets, he said, would more beautifully illustrate the geometrical ingenuity of the Creator than the crude geometry that had preceded him. So this, to me, is a vindication, not a refutation of the rational universe. Now, Christopher's portrayed religion as offering, you might say, bad answers or primitive answers superseded by better ones. Well, let's look at one of those bad answers. A long time ago, a group of ancient Hebrews wrote down in Genesis 1 a rather astonishing claim that the universe was created out of nothing. First there was nothing, then there was a universe. Now, it should be emphasized that this is not what any other religion believes. In most other religions, some god or gods fashioned the universe out of some pre-existing stuff. But the Jews said no, there was really nothing. And out of nothing came the universe. Poof. And these ancient Jews did no experiments. They were not scientists. They had no data. They basically said, God told me. For 2,000 years, their point of view seemed preposterous, evaluated by reason alone. In the Newtonian universe, the idea that something could come out of nothing was considered insane. But now, in the 20th century and in the early 21st century, we realize that the Big Bang, with the idea that not only did the universe have a beginning, not only did all of matter have a beginning, but space and time also had a beginning. Space and time are properties of our universe. And that means that before or beyond our universe, no space, no time. So this, to me, is not a simple, foolish statement in the first book of Genesis. It's an extremely profound claim on reality that bears a kind of eerie resemblance to what modern science has 2,000 years later discovered. And so I think these texts should be approached not with uncritical acceptance, but with a willingness to learn from them, to interrogate them, and to match their claims of reality against reality.
Is it reasonable to lift religious content out of its ancient context and critique or promote it hundreds of years later in another era using a different language, belonging to a different society, or possessing a different worldview.
It has to be done in the right way, and in fact, we see in Christianity, there's a saying in Christianity that the New Testament is in the Old concealed. The Old Testament is in the New revealed. It's another way of saying that there are intimations in the Old Testament that point to things that are going to happen in the New. The relationship between the books is complex. The cultures are different, the times are different, but there is a not only historical but a moral relationship between the two. When Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, and they're going up the mountain, and Isaac says to Abraham, where is the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide. And today, in a sense, we only read this as a story of primitive barbarity, but for Christians reading that, where is the lamb? Well, Christ is the Lamb of God. So it is the idea that God will provide is a way of saying that, look, here in the ancient world, animal sacrifice, this, in a sense, invitation to human sacrifice, but no, the ultimate sacrifice is Christ. And so there is this deep relationship between the works. When the Christians went out to convert, once they went beyond Jewish precincts, they debated, should the old Jewish laws be imposed on new converts to Christianity? And the general answer was no. Circumcision, Jewish dietary regulations, and so on, a lot of the codes of the Old Testament, those were culture-specific. So I think in looking at religion, we distinguish between enduring principles, which carry over, and culture-specific practices that may or may not carry over, depending on their context.
There are a couple of things from one question ago that I can't quite let pass, if you don't mind. One is Dinesh's permanent, flat-footed attempt to make a moral equivalence between scientific, or I would prefer to say rationalist belief, and faith. The word Big Bang has in common with the words suffragette, impressionist, Tory, and other expressions, the fact that it's invented as an insult. Fred Hoyle and other physicists confronted with this said, oh, I suppose you think it all began with a Big Bang. We call it that as a means of drawing the sting of the ignorant Professor Hoyle's taunt. And when we postulate dark energy, you have to always include, Dinesh, the term provisional. That's what we'll call it till we're better informed. A man of science, or let's say a man of reason, will do what Professor Haldane did. He said, I believe that without the theory of evolution, nothing makes sense. But with it, an enormous explanatory power is added to our arsenal of knowledge. A proposition I must say I consider myself to be self-evident. But, he said, I'll tell you now, and I'll tell you in advance what discoveries would make me give up the main belief of my life. And the trivial example he gave, I think, was rabbit bones in the Precambrian. I don't know. But you tell me any religion that will tell you in advance what, if established, would mean they'd have to give up their faith. You'll ask them in vain for anything like that. That's the distinction.
Let me actually pose that question. Dinesh, what would make you give up your faith? What discovery?
Well, look, I think that the religious view of reality has a lot of specific claims. The claim in Genesis 1, not only of creation, but in a sense specifying a certain general order of creation. You may say, prophecies in the book of Revelation, about the end times, which includes some fairly specific claims. The reunification of Israel, the Jews coming back to their ancestral homeland, pretty clearly asserted as something that will come to pass, leading some people to speculate we are in the end times. But what my point is, whether we are or not, it's a claim on reality. Either it's true or not. One day we'll die, and then we'll know. Well, if there's nothing, we won't know anything. But if there's life after death, we'll be in a position to find out. It is a claim that is a factual yes or no. It's not simply a hypothesis. It is you may say, a claim subject to eschatological verification. We will be one day in a position to know if we were right. The problem is we have to make decisions now in advance before we have that full information. And that's the dilemma of life. So faith is embedded in the real world, that every time I date a woman, I want to decide if I should propose marriage. One day I will know if life with her was what I thought it would be, but I don't know that in advance. I can be an agnostic. I can say I'll wait for the data to come in. But if I do that for too long, she'll marry someone else, so we'll both be dead. So at some point, I gotta put in the reason, put in the evidence, and take a leap of faith, one way or the other.
I have to suspect anyone who resorts to answers in Genesis. If the ancient Hebrews were smart enough to work out that the universe was created ex nihilo, which it is, and the word created is itself very controversial in that, emerged from, violently from, ex nihilo, nothingness, then why weren't they smart enough to work out that this was not done by someone who did 7 days' work, who made man out of a piece of mud, made woman out of a piece of him, and then told them that if they continued to seek knowledge, a talking snake would come and blackmail them. This is preposterous, Dinesh, and the further on it goes, the worse it gets, as you know. I'd rather listen to your dating game. Here's the difference. Here's the difference between reason and faith, not science and faith. If I hear that a group of peasants in northern Portugal have noticed that the statue of their Virgin Mary has started to weep or nod or smile, I know in advance it's not true, okay? And I know 4 or 5 ways in which that effect can be produced. And I can introduce anyone who challenges me to someone who knows how to produce that miracle. And until there's the smallest reason to believe that that wasn't it, or a hallucination, I don't waste my time saying, well, there are eyewitnesses to this. I take the view of David Hume, which I think is more or less irrefutable. If you appear to see the order of nature, or the rules of the natural order, suspended for any reason, you have no right to assume that they are being suspended, usually in your favor, by the way, and that that is a better explanation than that you are under a misapprehension. That works every time. Now just try and imagine this. Try and imagine any religion that doesn't depend, or didn't depend, or didn't get its start and its power over people originally by miracles and conjuring, by making people believe the impossible and attributing it to the divine. The parting of the Red Sea, the feeding of the 5,000, the horse that takes Muhammad on a night flight to Jerusalem, all kinds of wretched, piffle, burning bush, any of which is outdone completely for the awe-inspiring by just one glimpse through the Hubble telescope at what the real wonders and majesty and mystery of the universe are like. And religion has asked us to believe in these peasant fantasies and delusions, and has built a huge superstructure of power out of it, and reason rebels against that out of decency alone.
Living things are made out of mud, and what I mean by that is that if you ponder that statement, it is an extremely controversial claim that there is a relationship between living creatures and inanimate objects. It's one of the most startling discoveries of modern science that the same atoms and molecules that you find in stones and rocks are found not only in trees, but also in antelopes and human beings. So the idea that there's a relationship between mud, dead inanimate mud, and living human beings, far from being preposterous, turns out to be a scientific description of reality. Now, what about the idea of this talking snake and these miraculous events? First of all, let me say that if one were to read any other text, one were to read Hamlet or Macbeth with the same derisive idea, I'm not going to read this children's nonsense, a bunch of ghosts appearing in scene 1. It's absolutely preposterous. It's child's play. Shakespeare was a fool. I mean, this would be laughed out of any educated setting in America, any college classroom. Why? Because it fails to penetrate to the point of the episode. So what is the point of the talking snake? The point of the talking snake is to throw out a contrast. that in a sense, here is God offering humans two worlds. One is a safe, comfortable, protected world in which all the rules are made by God. That's the symbolism of you can't eat from the tree. Why not? No reason. It's a God-directed world. If there was a reason, then that reason would be supreme. But God is supreme. You can't eat because He says so. That's one option for us. Here's another world. And that's a world in which we humans say, no, we don't want to do it your way, God. We'd like to do it our way. We want to have a world where we get to act and we write the script of our own life and we follow our reason and our will. And that is the world of being out of Eden. Those two choices are dramatically presented, perhaps in symbolic form, but to simply write off the significance of that moral drama, which I think is one we face in everyday life. Do we want to live in a God-directed world? Because a God-directed world would have no suffering, no cancer. It would be God's world, but it would be a world in which we would be subordinated all the time to someone else's supreme will. See, Christopher Hitchens says that's a dictatorship. I don't want it. I want to live in my own world where I make the rules and I decide and I'm free. And that very choice is dramatized in the first book of Genesis, and that is the significance of the talking snake.
Christopher, he's quoting you. Would you like to reply?
Well, just to say that for an illustration of what I meant by the totalitarian character of religion, Dinesh could barely have improved by the example that he gives. You note that God creates people with the faculty of curiosity and inquiry and desire to expand their knowledge and their autonomy, and punishes them forever for their first exercise of it. That is totalitarianism almost defined. It's totalitarian dictator with a really warped and capricious sense of his playthings. It's best expressed by the poet Phil Greville, who says, created sick and commanded to be well. This is a sadomasochistic relationship that's being proposed here. It's not good for you. You are not told, no child has ever been told, repeatedly, as darkness falls, if you don't believe these stories, you're going to hell. Can't you see the difference? Religion makes rather large claims for itself, including the claim that its supernatural claims are actually true. And you have the option of declining this, as I do, but behind it then comes the threat. Okay, you're free to decline, but you will have an eternity of pain. For your reward, millions and millions of people had their childhoods hopelessly blighted by this terroristic, totalitarian propaganda. It's, I think, the best modern literary expression of it is Father Arnold's Easter sermon in James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist. But I'll rest my case with Thomas Paine and say any religion that is designed to outrage and terrify children is undeserving of the respect of humanity.
Adam and Eve were not punished forever. They were expelled in their natural life from Eden and given a world in which their will would be respected. Christopher Hitchens bemoans hell and yet has written publicly, I don't want to go to heaven. I don't want to, as he puts it, stand in the line and hand out garlands. He views God as a sort of celestial Kim Jong-il. And therefore, for him to be in heaven would be a kind of hell. And for God to say to Christopher, okay, you don't want to come here, I respect your will, is not a diminution of freedom, but an insistence upon it. It's a divine respect for that radical freedom of human choice, in which if we freely, remember the big difference between between a dictatorship, Kim Jong-il, Fidel Castro, is that you have no choice. You do this, and they'll make you if you don't want to. But go right back to Genesis 1. The whole point is Adam and Eve had direct communication with God. Yes, they had curiosity, but they knew that God was supreme. And God gave them this one prohibition. That's it. And still, such is the spirit of the rebellion, I guess, that they said, no, we don't want to do that. We refuse. And God said, all right, if you don't want to worship me, I'm not going to make you. The whole message of Genesis 1 is a message not of celestial dictatorship, but of rather remarkable celestial humbling to human freedom and the creation of a world that can accommodate that freedom, which happens to be our world right now.
Christopher, if you could interject your comments with the following question on morality.
Yes.
Are ethics and morality related to one's belief or denial in the existence of God?
Yes, and I'll give you this as an example of that, what I was about to say to Dinesh. By the way, I'm obliged to him for using his time to make so many of my points, sometimes even in my words, as with heaven and hell. But you don't expect people in the audience not to know, do you, that the Christian teaching is that in the fall of Adam, the sin of Adam and Eve, we were all indicted. That's what original sin means. We are all born with the guilt of that rebellious couple, and that guilt can only be washed away if we agree to a human sacrifice by which 1/3 of the Trinity agrees to be tortured to death and then resurrected in order to take away my sins. That's what you have to believe. And I would submit that that's an immoral doctrine, to get straight to your question. I don't just think that's fantastically untrue. I think that it's extremely immoral, and I'll tell you why. Because I think the idea of vicarious redemption as well as collective guilt are both immoral doctrines. I am not responsible for the sins of people who were born in prehistory, if they were born at all. Let's say were born in a legendary time, in the time of prehistory and myth. I refuse the charge made by Christianity that I'm born in sin because of their misconduct, because it's a hideous form of collective guilt of the sort that only the totalitarian mind could invent. But I further, and much more importantly, I think, repudiate the horrible idea of a human sacrifice standing proxy for redemption at second hand, vicarious redemption. I could pay your debt, brother, sister, if I wanted to, and you'd be quit of it, and I'd have done you a service. I could even serve your time in prison if I loved you enough. It's been done. It used to be possible. Or take your place in the army as recently as the Civil War, the war between the states. What I cannot do is relieve you of your responsibility. I cannot say, never mind that, just throw your sins on me and they'll all be washed away. The primitive name for that and the primitive origin of this obscene belief is scapegoating, where all the sins of the tribe are thrown onto an animal that then is driven into the desert, taking their responsibilities with it. We use the word scapegoating with contempt. How right we are. This is an immoral and unethical preachment, and it's done untold moral damage.
Dinesh, is that how you define redemption? And I'll have the same question with you.
We are responsible for no one's sins other than our own. On the other hand, our sins are such that no real atonement for them is really possible. What I mean by that is, let's say, for example, that I have wronged people by, let's say, hurting them or insulting them or demeaning them, torturing them. How do I atone for that? How do you atone for it? You stop doing it? I won't be rude and mean and cruel anymore? But that's not an atonement. You shouldn't be doing that in the first place. You haven't atoned for what you did. You simply agreed to stop doing it. So here's my point. Here we are as human beings flung into the world. We are Darwinian creatures struggling for survival and reproduction. And yet we all know that within us is a most unusual creature. Adam Smith calls him the impartial spectator. And this is the hidden, secret voice of conscience that acts against our self-interest and says, in effect, you want to do this to gratify your impulses, you want to do this, but no. And this voice has no coercive authority, but unquestioned moral authority. So we live on two levels. We live on the level of the real world, that's where we are now, and yet, through our inner beings, we can all envision a better world, a kind of higher world, a world of goodness and justice and truth and beauty. All political utopian movements of reform are based on that distinction between the way things are and the way things ought to be. So there's this chasm between reality as it is and reality as it ought to be. And every religion, and even non-religion, is based upon the question of how do we get from here to there? How do we bridge the chasm? Now, most religions, I will say, have a simple formula, and that is you build a ladder. You build a human ladder of codes and commandments and dietary regulations and the rest of it, and human beings can ascend step by step to this higher level. You may not get there, but you can get a little bit closer. Christianity, I think, is unique in basically saying, no, this chasm is too big, and that even if we can build a ladder, and some may get higher than others, but it's not going to make a real difference. If the chasm is to be bridged, and maybe it can't be, it has to be bridged from above. The divine level has to sort of descend or condescend to the human level, and that's the only way this can happen. So Christ, the atonement, is the divine bridge to the human level. I think we miss the force of Christ's action in the world if we don't see it as the divine attempt to close this chasm. So what about this idea of substitutionary sacrifice? I agree, in the human realm, it's impossible. Nobody can take our responsibility. But what if our responsibility is such that we are all saddled with it, none of us can get rid of it, and if we can't get rid of it, we can't enter into a pure place where there is no room for sin or stain or evil. How do we even get there? It's impossible. And the Christian point is to agree with Christopher Hitchens up to that point and say only a divine sacrifice can open the door. We can't. There is no human way to do it. Christopher's right about that. But there is a divine way. And so ultimately, Dante writes not a divine tragedy, but a divine comedy. Why? Because this unhappy story of human history does have not only a happy ending, but a happy ending available to everyone for the price of a single word. Yes. Even if you don't reform your life, all you have to do is accept the sacrifice being offered, and that's enough. So the point here is this a horrible, tragic, miserable doctrine? If there was some other way that human beings could effect our own salvation, I think we would try it. But if there is no other way, then we have no alternative but to fling ourselves on divine mercy. What other way is there?
On this question of the voice, the internal censor, that C.S. Lewis calls conscience, that Adam Smith indeed called the spectator, and so forth. It's peculiar to me that you, Dinesh, would say that that was something that we possess that's against our self-interest. I just want to reply to that. On Sigmund Freud's tombstone, it says, Die Stimme der Vernunft ist leiser. The voice of reason is very soft. Apparently the completed quotation says, but it's very persistent. I think you may find your own experience vindicates that. In a world that's dominated by fear and irrationality and panic and superstition, amazingly enough, people manage to keep their heads. And it is a voice that's almost impossible to extinguish, rather like the voice of conscience in that way. But who would say that it's not in our interest to have reason? If it wasn't for that, we would have died out. I would submit the same is true of our altruistic prompting, if you want to call it that. If we didn't have any feeling of solidarity with our fellow creatures, if we weren't able to do things that apparently don't benefit ourselves but do benefit our tribe, our species, whatever you want to call it, we would not have lived this long. We would not have been able to combine. We would not have been able to form a society. It is by no means a divine spark, rather it is a necessary condition for a not particularly brilliantly evolved primate species that's half a chromosome away from being chimpanzees, and it shows. And one reason we do better is because we have that bit of evolution and consciousness working in our favor. Christianity wants, again, this whole thing to be masochistic. If you do a good thing for someone else, it must be a sacrifice. It's got to cost. It's got to be some terrible masochistic display. That's not necessary at all.
The voice of reason and the voice of morality are not the same thing.
Certainly not.
And therefore, the impartial spectator is not a mere evolutionary extension of reason. It is ultimately a kind of stirring of the feeling that comes from within. Now, I think an example can help illustrate this, perhaps. If I was walking by the riverbank and I hear a cry of help, 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 I'm drowning. And if I'm not a very good swimmer, I take a quick look to make sure that it isn't grandma who's fallen in the pool. Because if it's someone closely related to me, then I have powerful evolutionary reasons related in genetic kinship to say, I want to help that person. On the other hand, if it's a total stranger, someone who's nothing to me, reason dictates that I should look after my own survival and keep going. That reason has been put in my mind by tens of millions of years of an imperative to survive in a difficult world. And yet, as I walk away following reason, a little light goes on in my head that prods me and says, you should help that person. This voice, far from being the voice of self-interest, if morality was identical with self-interest, we would not need morality. The whole point of morality is to array itself against what we want to do in any case. And that's why morality is so troublesome and irritating, because it is that little inner being that will not quit from saying no. So where does that voice come from? Not from reason. In fact, it is an anti-evolutionary voice that in a sense says, risk your own survival. That would be the right thing to do, even though you might drown. And which of us doesn't have morality? In fact, morality is such a definition of humanity that human beings who don't have morality are basically called psychopaths or sociopaths.
Yeah, who are also the children of God, by the way, made in his image.
Pardon?
Who, according to you, are also God's children and made in his image. Why does this design perforce include so many sociopaths who are indifferent to other people and unaware of their existence, and psychopaths who positively enjoy violating all the rules of decency?
Because human faculties can break down and get perverted. It's not a refutation of being in the image of God that you lose your moral faculties, or the moral faculties are perverted by child abuse or some other form of torture.
Or don't have them in the first place. But I didn't say that morality and reason were the same at all. I just said that they're both inextinguishable, but they're both very useful to us, and without them we wouldn't have survived. I'm not proposing a reductionist theory of morality as simply functionalist, but it's not possible to consider it soberly if you think of it as a compulsory sacrifice demanded by God for your fellow creatures, that you have to love them as you love yourself, an impossible injunction to obey.
Of course,
which you'll always be guilty, therefore, of disobeying, so you're always in terror of being punished for that. Why do you make this huge, huge superstructure of amoral speculation when there's a perfectly clear, I would almost want to say scientific, natural philosophical explanation that's perfectly satisfying without this coercion?
Well, I think our positions are so close that I almost have to pull myself away from what you're saying. You're saying, when I was growing up in India, we learned a proverb, the tears of strangers are only water. And I think that idea, which seems very cruel to us or insensitive, really reflects the universal and in fact the Darwinian idea that we feel sympathy in concentric circles. Our family is closest, and then our relatives, and then our neighbors, and then our tribe, and then our country. And then Adam Smith says that if tomorrow we learned there was a horrible famine in China, we would all bemoan it for about 5 minutes and then resume eating our dinner or our breakfast. Why? Because our human sympathies don't extend that far and can't hold. So here's Christianity making, if you will, an inhuman claim, and that is we owe a debt even to the stranger, that we are universally linked as brothers. Now what I would say is it impossible? Yes, it is. And yet, without that idea, is the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the idea of the equal dignity of humans, the idea that if there's a famine tomorrow in Haiti, we should respond even though those people are nothing to us, All of those ideas are traceable to this imperious, ridiculous, inhuman command, and yet our civilization, even our secular values, are parasitic on that very same command.
You act as if the term reciprocity was never invented.
It's not reciprocity, it's universal brotherhood.
Well, universal brotherhood is a more emotional way of putting it. And when I was a socialist, which I was for many years, one of our favorite subjects was the way the British National Health Service never runs out of blood and has never paid 1 penny for a donation. And it still is a pleasure for me to go and give a pint. And I'll give you my reasons. One, I don't actually lose that pint. You have a lie down, nice strong cup of working class brown tea, and some water, and very soon you've regained that pint, but someone else has got one. So that's a very rare thing, a free, I won't say lunch, unless you're very peculiar. But a benefit that is, as it were, shared by all. Second, as it happens, I have a very rare blood group, and I very much want there to be enough blood in that bank when I might need it, which the other day I very suddenly did. But third, there's no doubt about it, I got pleasure from doing it. Can't tell you why. Don't feel I have to. Don't think there's anything supernatural to be taken into consideration. Don't require the strenuousness of the sadomasochistic imperative to justify that. I expect there are enough humanists among you simply to know what I mean by it. Why make that more complex than it need be?